My brother said, "Your company is basically mine, your family." I let him talk. Then I opened the audit folder. His confidence collapsed in minutes. At 27, I was a man working as an airfield operations specialist in Tucson, Arizona. My father, Keith Grayson, was 45, and we'd been financially tangled for 4 years. A mortgage, escrow payments, and my credit score were tied to the same house. When he went cold and let relatives paint me as reckless, I chose myself. Most days started before sunrise near Broadway Boulevard. I checked runway lights, logged hazards, and drank coffee on the move. Routine mattered to me. If something was important, it got written down. I kept 2 items with me like tools: a red accordion file that never closed right, a steel mechanical pencil with a chewed eraser cap. The file held every paper I might need. The pencil handled every number I didn't trust. My shift ended mid-morning at Cactus Sky Regional. I drove to a little spot off 4th Avenue called Desert Kettle Cafe. The same cashier handed me the same breakfast burrito. It cost $8.75 and tasted like consistency. After that, I'd swing past the house near Reed Park. It was a simple place with cracked gravel and a mesquite tree. That house was the reason my stomach stayed tight. My name sat on the mortgage next to Keith's name. The deal had started with a promise. Keith said he needed help just for a while. He was rebuilding after a messy split. He also had old debt that dragged his interest rate up. I was 23 and trying to be loyal. That was my flaw, and it cost me time. Keith said, "I'll refinance once I'm steady." I said, "Okay, but everything stays transparent." For a while, it looked fine. We split the monthly payment of $19.40. I paid by transfer with a memo every time. He paid sometimes, mostly with checks. When my pay bumped to $74K, I covered more. Keith called it temporary and never defined the end. Family treated it like a shared resource. If Keith needed air conditioning service, I got asked. Denise, my aunt, called it support. I called it a slow drain. We met as a family at Sonor and Skillet Diner near Grant Road. Breakfast for 3 ran about 46 before tip. Denise would smile and say, "You're a good son." Keith would nod like he approved of me. Then my big opportunity showed up, clean and specific. A recruiter called me during a walk at Relito Park. The job was airport safety manager at Atlantic Runway Systems. It was in Providence, Rhode Island. The offer was $121K base with a 9% bonus target. Relocation reimbursement was capped at $9,400. Health insurance was better too. My share of premiums would drop by $110 a month. I brought the offer home and tried to be careful. I didn't demand. I explained. Keith was in the kitchen, tapping a calculator. My steel pencil lay beside my red file. He read the offer, then snorted. He said, "That's a fancy title for a hall monitor." I stared at him, surprised by the bite. I said, "It's a real step forward." Keith didn't look up. He said, "You'll fall apart out there." That was the first time he tried to make me small. "It wouldn't be the last," I said. "I can still help transition the house." Keith laughed like I was naive. He said, "You're not going anywhere." I said, "I'm giving notice in 3 weeks." Keith's eyes flicked toward me cold. He said, "Not until you fix this mortgage." The next day, my call went to voicemail. The day after that, my call went to nothing at all. Keith stopped answering texts. He stopped speaking unless Denise was nearby. Then the whispering started. It came from people who never asked me directly. My cousin Calvin cornered me at the El Presidio neighborhood festival. He held a lemonade and watched me like a stranger. He said, "You're acting erratic lately." I said, "Who told you that?" Calvin shrugged. He said, "Everyone's worried." Denise stepped in, voice sweet. She said, "Don't take it personally." I felt heat rise in my face. I said, "I'm calm, I'm just saying no." Denise tilted her head. She said, "Your tone is always so sharp." It was a trick, make me defend my tone, not their story. When I got home, I opened my red accordion file. I slid out mortgage statements and escrow notices. My steel pencil tapped the table twice. I wrote a simple list of facts: who paid what, When, how, with memo lines. I requested a payment history from the lender. I did it by email to keep a trail. The subject line read, "Request, full payment history and escrow ledger." I printed it and filed it under mortgage. 2 days later, the lender responded with a PDF. I circled every month I had covered extra. My transfers carried clear bank memo lines. Mortgage payment, Grayson property. Escrow shortage catch up. Keith's checks showed up inconsistently. Some months, nothing appeared at all. I wasn't angry yet. I was focused. I emailed Keith one clear message. The subject line read, "Plan to refinance or list the home." I wrote that I was relocating for work. I wrote that my name had to come off. Keith replied within 12 minutes. He said, "Stop threatening me." I didn't threaten. I set a boundary. I wrote back, "This is a timeline, not a fight." I used my steel pencil to mark the date. Denise called me that night from a number I recognized. Her tone was syrupy and sharp. She said, "You're punishing your father." I said, "I'm protecting my credit." Denise exhaled loudly. She said, "You're being a tiny tyrant." I almost laughed at the insult. It was childish, but it stung. I said, "No more phone calls, email only." She said, "That's how villains talk." The smear got louder once they lost access to me. My cousin Calvin stopped replying entirely. A neighbor asked why I looked so tense. Another neighbor said Keith told people I was unreliable. Keith let the story grow because it helped him. If I sounded unstable, my boundary sounded cruel. He had two motives, and I saw them clearly. He wanted my credit, and he wanted a scapegoat. A week later, he made the real ask. He showed up at my job's perimeter gate. His truck idled while I stood in a reflective vest. I held my red file like a shield. Keith didn't waste time. He said, "Sign for a home equity line." I blinked. I said, "No." Keith's face tightened. He said, "It's for repairs." I said, "Show me bids and receipts." He said, "You don't get to interrogate me." I stared at him. I said, "Then you don't get my signature." Keith leaned forward. He said, "You're an emotional grenade." That one landed. Not because it was clever, but because it was meant to hurt. I kept my voice steady. I said, "Email me the details." Keith drove off without answering. He left exhaust and silence behind. That night, I drove to a bank branch on Speedway Boulevard. I asked for printed copies of every transfer I'd made. The banker handed me a thick packet. The pages smelled like toner and relief. I slid the packet into my red file. The file bulged, but it closed. Then I scheduled a consultation with a housing finance attorney. Her name was Renee Delgado. Renee's office sat near downtown Tucson, above a fictional place called Copper Cigarro Legal. The waiting room smelled like citrus cleaner. Renee didn't ask for feelings first. She asked for documents. I set the red accordion file on her desk. I placed my steel pencil beside it like a bookmark. Renee scanned the lender packet. She said, "You've paid more than your share." I said, "They're calling me unreliable." Renee nodded once. She said, "That's pressure, not truth." I said, "I want to end this cleanly." Renee outlined options in plain language. Demand refinance into Keith's sole name or list voluntarily. She also explained a formal notice letter. Not a threat, but a legal boundary. Renee's fee was $375 for the letter. I paid it without hesitating. I left her office and sat in my car at 3:18 p.m. I breathed until my hands stopped trembling. The next morning, I received another email from the lender. The subject line read, "Re-borrower inquiry documentation required." It listed what they needed for any refinance: income verification, tax returns, debt schedule. I printed it and slid it into the red file. My steel pencil underlined debt schedule twice. That afternoon, I sent Keith a short email. The subject line read, "Documentation needed for refinance." I wrote, "If you want my name off, we follow this list." I didn't add guilt. I didn't add emotion. Keith replied with one sentence. He said, "You always loved controlling paperwork." I didn't respond. I forwarded the thread to Renee. Renee mailed her formal notice letter by certified mail. It required Keith to choose refinance or list. It also required him to stop spreading false claims. It wasn't dramatic, just firm. When the letter arrived, Denise exploded quietly, not in public but in private messages to relatives. Calvin texted me at 9:13 p.m. He wrote, "You're really doing this to him." I didn't argue with him. I texted back one line. I wrote, "Read the letter. It explains everything." A few days later, Keith finally called. I didn't answer. I waited for an email like I had stated. Keith refused at first. He drove to the house and left a note on my windshield. The note called me a human IOU. I picked it up and put it in the red file. I didn't reply to the note. My quiet planning moved forward. I accepted the Providence offer. I started looking for apartments on the east side. I compared rents and deposits like a checklist. One place on Thayer Street wanted $17.20 a month. Another near Federal Hill wanted $15.60 but required a $1,100 deposit. I didn't sign anything yet. I just lined up options. I also packed slowly. 2 boxes a night, labeled with my steel pencil. I didn't remove things from the house that weren't mine. I took only what I owned and what I had bought. Keith tried another angle when he realized I was serious. He invited me to talk at Desert Porch BBQ, a fictional spot near St. Philip's Plaza. Denise and Calvin were already there. They sat like a panel. Keith slid into the booth across from me. His face was calm, but his eyes were hard. He said, "You're embarrassing me." I said, "I'm asking for accountability." Denise leaned in. She said, "You're stressing him out." Calvin added his own jab. He said, "You're acting like a grudge machine." I set my red file on the table. The server brought water and an 11.50 iced tea. I kept my voice even. I said, "The lender needs documents." Keith waved a hand. He said, "My income is private." I said, "Then listing is the other option." Keith's jaw flexed. He said, "You're not taking my home." I said, "I'm removing my obligation." Denise scoffed. She said, "You're obsessed with control." I looked at her steady. I said, "I'm obsessed with not being used." Keith leaned forward, voice low. He said, "You owe me for raising you." I didn't raise my voice. I said, "That's not how contracts work." Keith slammed his palm on the table once. The water glass trembled. He said, "You'll regret this." I said, "I'm already fixing it." That was the showdown. No yelling from me, just a boundary with a deadline. 2 days later, the signature scene happened. It was a mortgage underwriting call scheduled by the lender. I sat at my kitchen table with my red file open. My steel pencil rested on a blank notepad. The underwriter asked about occupancy and payment history. I answered plainly. I said, "I'm relocating for work." I said, "I need release from the loan." The underwriter asked if Keith was prepared to refinance a loan. I said, "He has been notified in writing." The underwriter asked if I had proof of contributions. I said, "Yes, with bank memo lines." I read 3 memos aloud, calm and clear. The call stayed professional the entire time. When the call ended, I felt lighter. Not victorious, just grounded. Keith could no longer pretend I was bluffing. A lender doesn't care about pride. A week later, Keith emailed me at last. The subject line read, "Fine, what do you want?" I wrote back with one sentence. I said, "Refinance or list by the deadline." Keith replied with 2 words. He said, "We'll list." That was the payoff moment. He realized I had already started the process. He hadn't expected me to handle it legally. He expected noise, not paperwork. Keith hired a real estate agent without telling me. I found out through a lender notification. The notice included a scheduled showing window. I printed it and slid it into the red file. The first open house happened on a Saturday. I stayed away and let the process work. Denise texted me a photo of the sign in the yard. She wrote, "Happy now." I didn't respond. I was packing. I moved my remaining things into a storage unit near South Tucson. The unit cost $138 a month plus a 22 lock fee. My red file stayed in my backpack. My steel pencil stayed in my pocket. The house sold after several showings. Keith had to disclose the shared loan history. The sale paid off the mortgage and closed the loan. The lender sent the confirmation in writing. I received an email with a simple subject line. It read, "Loan paid in full, account closed." I printed it, then exhaled slowly. The paper felt like quiet. Keith did not thank me. He also didn't smear me anymore. Without my name attached, his leverage disappeared. So did his interest in calling me reckless. I flew to Providence with 2 suitcases and a backpack. The flight cost $312 and I didn't mind. The city felt dense and new, brick buildings, narrow streets, cold air. My apartment sat a short walk from India Point Park. I watched ships slide across the water like slow thoughts. The first weeks at Atlantic Runway Systems were intense. I learned names, procedures, and personalities. I carried my steel pencil every day. It helped me remember that details mattered. I kept the red accordion file in my desk drawer. It held onboarding forms and my relocation receipts. My daily work had a rhythm: morning inspections, incident reports, and radio checks. Within 4 months, I led a hazard review project. It reduced runway vehicle near misses from 5 a month to 1. My supervisor shook my hand after a briefing. He said, "You're the steady kind." I didn't brag. I just kept building my life. I set a financial milestone that belonged only to me. Saved $27K in an emergency fund within 11 months. I automated transfers after every paycheck. The memo line in my bank app read, "Future Fund." When the balance hit $27,000, I sat in Waterplace Park. I listened to the fountain and let myself smile. Back in Tucson, the consequences spread quietly. Denise stopped getting involved. Calvin sent me a short message that felt uncomfortable. He wrote, "I didn't know you paid that much." I replied with one line. I wrote, "I kept records, that's all." Keith tried a return attempt in late winter. He called from a new number. I let it go to voicemail. Then an email appeared the next morning. Keith wrote that he was renting now. He wrote that his rate was higher than expected. He asked if I could co-sign just one time. He asked like the last year never happened. I wrote back politely and short. I said, "I can't attach my name to that." Keith replied within minutes. He said, "You've changed." I didn't argue. I let that be true. A year later, my life felt fully mine. I had my job, my apartment, and a quiet circle of friends. I walked along Benefit Street on a windy afternoon. I thought about how small my world used to feel. I opened my red file one last time that night. Not from pain, just closure. Email subject, request, full payment history and escrow ledger, email subject. Documentation needed for refinance, email subject. Loan paid in full, account closed. Keith sent an apology message a few days after that. It was simple, which surprised me. He wrote, "I handled it wrong." He wrote, "I let pride make me cruel." He wrote, "I shouldn't have let them label you." He wrote, "I'm sorry." I replied once and kept it clean. I wrote, "I appreciate the apology, take care." Then I made tea and put the red file away. My steel pencil stayed on my desk, ready for tomorrow. Here's what I learned from all of it. When people rewrite you, records keep you sane. My boundary rule now is non-negotiable, no shared debt, ever again. If I could do anything differently, I'd set that rule earlier. I don't need revenge to feel whole. I need clarity, quiet, and a life I can breathe in.